Hello, and welcome to the Higher Ed AI Lab podcast, where we explore how AI is shaping the future of higher education. I'm your host, Suraj, a recent MBA grad from Berkeley with a background in social impact. As a former TA and someone working in the AI space, I'm fascinated by how it's reshaping learning and the next generation. Today, I'm excited to introduce someone I've known since undergrad. He's a Bay Area-based technologist with a social impact background and engineering. He studied industrial engineering with me at Georgia Tech, served as class president at Berkeley Haas, and has spent years in supply chain, digital transformation, ed tech, and now he's at Khan Academy, leading teams using Gen AI to build new learning experiences for millions of students. It's amazing to see someone that I know doing this work, especially someone who cares so deeply about education and mentorship. Let's give it up for Alex Berry.
Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to be here. And even that introduction just reminded me and joggled in my mind how one of our first experiences together was actually teaching. Way back in the day, we were actually sort of teaching assistants together back at Georgia Tech. What a wild, crazy space. How now, almost a decade later, how we are still so deeply caring about both the craft of teaching, the process of education, and most importantly, like how we can go and deliver some of the best learner outcomes for these amazing individuals we call students. So I love how full circle these moments have come.
Oh man, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I almost forgot that. Yeah, one of our first experiences together was putting together a curriculum for Georgia Tech first year students. With that, I'd like to kick it off by just asking a question that we ask all our guests at the beginning. Tell me something good, something from the week or something that you're grateful for.
I think something that I'm just truly grateful for. So, I'm on maybe week 4 over here at Khan Academy as a full-time employee. And something I'm truly grateful for is just how crazy and non-standard these first 2 weeks have been. My first week of the company, we had sort of a division-wide kind of offsite over in a different country. So that was just a great way to meet, Khan Academy is mostly remote first as from a culture and from a practical standpoint, but to meet, 30 to 40 individuals just all together and meet them in person, it was just such a great way to start off my career. And then week 2 was a company-wide hackathon. So, you got hundreds of people around the company, not exactly doing their day jobs and hopping back and forth between these amazing sort of small teams, delivering cool, new, rapid ideas, and also going trying to validate those ideas really quickly with real life people. So like, I love the scrappiness of it. And it's not necessarily what you think about when you think of Khan Academy as this sort of, 30-year-old, more mature nonprofit educational organization. And we're sitting here looking like the scrappiest startups, building things in some of the coolest and most empathetic ways.
Wow, I love that. I love hearing about ways in which companies, whether it's like Google or like you mentioned for Khan Academy, like internal hackathons. I know when I was at Deloitte, that was a big, like we had internal business pitch competitions just to like ways that you continually innovating an organization, I think are really important. I'd like to jump in and really open with something that's been on my mind. So ever since I was teaching an intro level business course, a core class at Berkeley for undergrad students, and I remember the first time that I had to sit down and grade papers, I I came across an essay, and this is one in where everyone, if you're using ChatGPT, at least Berkeley's policies that you cite it in the references. And I remember the first time I came across an essay where a student had clearly used ChatGPT, and it made me reflect on what is like if I look at my time in college, a 500 word or even 3 to 8 page essay would have taken me at least an all-nighter to do all the research I needed to do to really like put together a solid thesis and just fill up the pages at the very least. What is the future of education going to look like, and what does it look like if somebody can now generate that same amount of text and even add some citations in literally just like a prompt, 30 seconds?
Mm. So first, my heart honestly immediately goes out to the teachers, for professors, particularly at the middle school and the high school level.
Yeah.
And the reason why it goes out there first is because like that's where a lot of those sort of formative critical thinking skills, that's where they first really start to get tested. That's where you go from like sentences to paragraphs to expressing your own creativity and your point of view. And the reason I bring it up and I kind of start it there is when we're thinking about the future of education, we always have to go back to like, what's the, not just the current state, but what's the point of education? Like, why do I, as a teacher at any grade level, assign you something, right? What am I trying to measure? I'm trying to help measure, I'm trying to help prove that you can express and communicate a particular point of view, and an essay, for whatever reason, particularly for folks in like the English language arts world or ELA, that's been one of the primary ways and primary diagnostic tools of how I can understand that you get the information, right? Cheating's always been a thing, right? No one would ever ask me to write their essay for them because I am an extraordinarily slow essay writer. But like,
Yeah.
there's always been ways for people to go and get help that's maybe outside the system. But here, now it's like, we really are having to distinguish, is the mechanism of delivery for essays or for just like writing or just for sort of demonstrating your critical thinking. Is it the output we care about? Like, hey, you have a 3 to 8 page essay. Hey, you have 500 words. Or is that elucidating how shoddy a proxy that is for the actual outcome? The outcome that we want is that students are able to showcase their critical thinking skills, their point of view, their creative tone, their creativity. The output is I see that in an essay. I'm not necessarily saying that like we're gonna have to like change the assignments, but maybe it's like, hey, like I think of like some of the classes that I used to go and teacher TA for, where we would kind of have like a more of an interim check where it's like, hey, like you get points for your first draft, right? Your rough draft, your outline, if even you get points for your outline, then you get maybe an additional sort of check-in for your rough draft. And so maybe like the actual the final state of your paper has a much less weighted grading because I really cared about your process. And so maybe where education might be going, if we've made it so easy for people to get to some output, maybe now we're able to go and we have to grade more on the process. And that might be where the change in assignments and the change in how we administer and grade comes. And let's be honest, if technology can figure out how to make a computer guess random words in a way that makes sense, I'm sure we can come up with innovations for how we can make grading and assignments a little bit more sensible for what we're actually trying to measure, this creativity, this point of view, this critical thinking.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point in terms of shifting the focus to what truly are you trying to assess at. There was a ninth grade English teacher in Indiana who's been super into AI, and I've had a meeting with him a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that he mentioned was like, especially even with his English students, having to really hone in on for just this assignment for just this week or month. I'm just focusing on like your ability to do good solid thesis statements or good solid like again ninth grade. So you're thinking more about basics of writing and your ability to articulate yourself. But I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of if output can be generated instantly, right, and I can create 4 different versions of it, really you're having to question like what is the purpose of the curriculum, right? What am I hoping to assess in a student, and then how am I observing them throughout the process? I like the way that you kind of mentioned it, breaking it down. A core part of the neuroscience of teaching, right, is that you learn and retain more when you're making mistakes and when you're putting in effort. With the way AI is being used, whether it's a Khan Academy or in general in the education space, um, how are you seeing AI being used to promote more effort when it feels like it's really designed to just undo a lot of effort?
Oh gosh, I love that question. And in one word, the answer for me is multimodal. So let me give you an example from, I'll go back to sort of high school outlets, right? High school outlets liked a lot of the English and the language and history stuff a lot more than the math and science. Kind of crazy. I ended up an engineer, if I'm perfectly honest with you. And one of the reasons I like that is because a lot of my English and literature teachers got really creative, right? We're going to read a book, and every now and then they would change it up and they'd be like, hey, we really, really care about how you have analyzed and understood this particular form of media. But you don't have to write an essay. Make a movie about this concept. Make a short film, go out with you and your band of friends and make a movie that shows us that you can analyze, understand, compare, maybe like, rewrite the last scene of this book, how the Scarlet Letter should have ended, things of that nature. Now, what that did was it took a kid who looked at a book like The Scarlet Letter and was like, this is not interesting. I'll be honest with you. I read the first third and the last third and just kind of skipped the middle. And then it gave me the sense of, wait, you want me to reimagine how this book should have ended? Oh gosh. Went and read the middle of the book because I needed to know this thing so I could reimagine how this book should have ended, what should have happened. Right. And now the reason I bring that up as such a cool thing and why that's not necessarily the path, but why this is the future is in the same way that it has made it easier for us to generate output. That also means that I can take a traditional assignment, right? Hey, like our class, we're going to read the Scarlet Letter, and I needed some assignment that shows me that you have understood and can think critically about the book. Now, maybe I can take my normal assignment, which is an essay, and generate 5 different types of projects, right? One's going to be a group project, which you can elect to go into. One's going to be an essay assignment for those folks who that's how you better learn. One's maybe going to be a haiku, a string of haikus about the Scarlet Letter that you're going to go and create. All of a sudden, I can go and I can create these different versions of this assignment where maybe different students might opt into different things, right? One of the things that I learned at Georgia Tech, which I'm sure you may have also learned this, is that for certain types of assignments, I don't actually learn best by myself in a room with the door locked for like 10, 12 hours a day, just trying to go and write these papers. I learn really well in group work. So though you still want to go and at a certain level have and track and understand where an individual is on the fundamental skills, I think that in the multimodal world, there might be a way to go and still be able to measure some of those same outcomes, but in a more interesting and creative way, and maybe even allow the students to kind of opt in for what might go and make sense for them, or at least give them some kind of options. So like that's the world I see generative AI enabling. And also making it easier for a teacher who maybe hasn't been able to go and to think about the ramifications of what a certain assignment looks like in different medium. Now we can instantly go and generate a rubric for them to go into debate to talk about with other teachers, as opposed to let me spend 2 hours creating a completely new assignment and create completely different medium. Oh, also let me now go and maybe create some example projects, some example ideas to help spur my students on, right? If I'm a teacher and I'm creating a new assignment, I want to go to a student and say, hey, if you just go and spend 5 minutes doing this assignment with generative AI, here's what that AI SOP looks like. This is a C. I just went and did this. I just went and created this. This is C work. So whatever you do, however you do it, it needs to be better than this C work that I just did in 5 minutes. That would be completely impossible for a teacher to go and to generate like, here's a C essay, here's a B essay, here's an A essay, and to give that as a good examples of students. Anyways, I'll kind of leave it there, but you can kind of see in my mind how for me, this could potentially give some really good expansive ways of not just differentiating teaching and differentiating education, but also giving teachers some really, really good and powerful tools to reach those students who do not care about the middle third of the Scarlet Letter, like me.
I love that. I love that example of using a tool like generative AI or ChatGPT to generate like 6 different examples that touch on different learning styles. What are other ways? Because I know Khan Academy has different teaching tools as well. What are some other ways in which you've seen teachers use AI creatively in a way to help their classrooms?
So I think one thing, and I'll actually kind of like speak to this, and this is going back to like on my last teaching experiences over at Berkeley. I think one way that should be really creative and also sort of root some of your students in a certain amount of empathy is actually like having students teach class for a day, right? So now imagine this, right? So one of the things that every teacher has to do is to like make a lesson plan, right? And if you're at a public school, which is like, I don't know, 85% of students in K through 12 system in the US go to public school, you need to have a teaching curriculum that is aligned to certain unit standards and help keeps the class on track. Well, we can use it easier with AI to take certain types of content and to align that to a particular sort of standard, now how much easier could it be to say, hey, Alex and your merry band of four folks, on December 4th, you all are in charge of teaching the class about what you learned from the Scarlet Letter, right? You have to come up and you have to satisfy these types of things. Now the student might go and say, crap, I have to make a lesson plan for the day. That's a higher order of thinking, right? Now you're asking the student to understand, to plan, to communicate, to collaborate, to engage, and to empathize, right? And it's impossible. And again, I say this from personal experience. It's impossible to teach about the Scarlet Letter if you do not know what happens in the Scarlet Letter. So like that kind of thing is something I've seen done something similar like that in my own classrooms. And I've also heard of other teachers, again, thinking really creatively about how could they come up with other engaging ways and then use AI maybe in a ways of like creating more standardized and more simpler like grading rubrics, quickly going and helping to generate and to brainstorm different types of things. Also just being able to go and have maybe a better sort of like administrative tracking of their students, right? One more maybe an example I'll give. Let's say we are in a 10th grade honors English class. And we have a traditional writing assignment, right? We're going to work on a essay about a historical figure, right? You know, compare Martin Luther King and Malcolm X is a great one. I feel like that was every essay I wrote in 10th grade.
Yep.
So obviously, we want students at the end to have this output, right? We want them to have an essay, but we also want people to go through the normal standard sort of writing process. We want them to think about an outline. We want them to flesh it out, do some brainstorming. We want people to have a first draft. We want people to review that first draft. But here's the thing, right? We got 30 kids in class who all are going to move at their own pace. They all have different strengths, different weaknesses. And it might be helpful for me as a teacher to understand where is each of my students, where are they getting stuck, right? You know, I got 20% of the class who's still in outline phase after a day or two. Oh my gosh, what a great time for me to go and be able to check in with them, be like, hey, Alex, just want to check in. How's that outline going? Oh, you want to show me a first draft? Oh my gosh, let's make that happen. So I think some of the products, even for example, like Khan Academy's writing coach, is really, really great at helping to elucidate that process of where the student is and can help teachers have certain intervention sort of mechanisms and to be able to say like, hey, these students might need a little bit more support, or these students are doing really, really great. Here's how we can get them to the next level and not make them feel slowed down. So this kind of intervention / differentiation and lets the students who are ready to go fast. And it also lets you know where do certain students need some of that more individual support. So I think for me, like those process things and being able to give students the individual attention because you know where they are in the process, that's another really cool thing that AI actually allows us to do.
So that reminds me, because I just finished reading the Sal Khan's book about Brave New Words, and I think he mentioned something very similar to what you just mentioned around like being able to use generative AI technology, right, to be able to provide what he's wanted to do for decades, right, which is forever, right, a personalized tutor that goes at your pace, at the student's pace. Can you speak more for someone who doesn't know how the writing coach works? How is it different than just like handing a ChatGPT tool to a classroom of 10th graders? Like, what's different about it? Walk us through it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Like so many things. But I think three things kind of come to mind. So first off, like the overall goal of writing coach is that it focuses on making better writers, not just making better writing. So a lot of the checks that it sort of walks the student through is like, hey, like, you know, we really want to go and see this outline. Hey, like in this first draft, like your teacher has mentioned that they're really focused on the thesis. Can you help us identify like the thesis of this? So it really focuses on these very fundamental building blocks. And then it also goes and based off of the different stages that you're going through.
Oh, when you say it, so this is like a bot that you're like on Khan Academy's portal or something like that.
Yes. I'm
Yeah.
so sorry. So like, so one of the things that like my team goes and works on is we call it Khanmigo. It is Khan Academy's sort of AI tutor. You can think of it, you can think of it in the form of like an AI chatbot that has been sort of trained and sort of tuned in a very particular way to
Got it.
make it so it's really good at not just giving away the answers versus like when you think of maybe like a chat GPT, oftentimes that is really optimized to help give an answer immediately as opposed to helping you really think critically about that process, right? And there's also a lot of other kind of like more moderation things built in which are really important to schools because you want students learning in a very, very safe way. So like within Writing Coach, one of the things that you're able to go on to do is like, let's say you're a student and you get stuck, like, hey, Khan Academy or hey, Khanmigo, like, I think this is my thesis statement and I would love some feedback on it. That could be something you could chat about and get that actual more immediate feedback, which can be really, really helpful. And of course, the teacher can go and can see the feedback, can see sort of like the back and forth chat. And that's really, really good, right? In the same way where if you and I were in a classroom and I'm like, hey, Suraj, I could really use a review over this part of my essay,
Yeah.
right? And the teacher would see that in person and would see, oh man, Alice is good. He's got support, right? Versus maybe there's a kid over in the corner who just needs someone to check in, just needs to know someone cares about their writing. So I think that actually is one of the main differences. And that's really important because you actually touched on something really crucial, particularly with writing. Scientifically, and I don't exactly understand how or why this works, but we write better. We care more about our writing. We take more ownership of our writing when we know that there's somebody, a person, a human being on the other end who wants to read it.
Mm.
So I don't want to ever minimize the importance of a teacher being able to go and be like, oh my gosh, Alex, I read your outline. I'm so excited about what you're going to write. Or, hey, I read your first two paragraphs. I got a couple curious questions, but this is going to be really, really amazing. Here's how we can make it even better.
Yeah.
That nudge from a human person is actually a core part of how like the Writing Coach project is built to not take that away.
Mm.
Um, so even when you think about like, maybe there's other tools from even like other competitor products or just other AI sort of reading and literature tools that's like, hey, teacher, let's make it really easy for you to assign random content and to get that graded really, really quickly so you don't have to look at it. There are some ethical and kind of moral challenges there, but like the main thing from a learning outcome standpoint is we don't write for the bot. When you were writing an email, you're not like, wow, someone's Gmail filter is going to read this. Let me make it really nice and professional. You're like, oh, my boss, oh, my mom, oh, my teacher's going to read this email. That's why I care.
Yeah.
And so we had to go and be really thoughtful about how do we preserve that aspect of the human to human
Mm.
connection while being thoughtful about like how can we go and sort of make it so like a teacher can have really extended capacity, right? How can a teacher have that visibility, be like, oh my gosh, there's 30 people working heads down. Here's the 5 areas where I need to float first. And that's really a little bit more of like where we're focusing our time.
Yeah, that there's something that you mentioned that really I think resonated with me. This idea right around it's come up in even in the last example you gave around audience. So part of asking a student to say, "Hey, teach the class for the day," what you're doing
Mhm.
is getting them for the first time to think about the content, not just in terms of how they're reacting and learning it, but learning it enough and then thinking about how do I communicate this to a specific audience. And I think
Mhm.
similarly, that's something that as I'm talking to you, I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Even in a workshop I do around thinking clearly in the age of AI, where I'm coaching undergrad students around like focusing on process. A big part of it is like, how do you assess whether even an email is good enough to send? But you have to understand who it is that you're writing for, understand their
Mhm.
wants and needs. Right. This is what we did in negotiations class, if you remember in Haas. And I think on that, that's a really good point. I mean, intuitively, it makes a lot of sense in terms of I am more likely to write better if I know that I'm going to have a person that whose opinion I care about, or even a person just at the end of that assignment that will be reading this and giving me feedback. What are ways that you've seen where you think AI should probably not be used or that we should just avoid it
Mhm.
because I do have this concern, that's this growing concern of like, okay, is my AI going to talk to your AI, right? My AI is going to write my essay, and you can grade my your AI can grade my essay. You know what I mean?
Oh my gosh, yes. Whew, gosh.
Big topic,
I think
guys. Just
I think two thoughts
yeah.
have gone and have come to mind. Maybe three, maybe three. I'll kind of go through these quickly. So first, and I'll credit this first thought to maybe not myself, but I'm lucky enough to work with some amazing ELA or English and language arts experts, people who are former teachers who've taught like a variety of grades, who have really helped me stay grounded.
Yeah.
Because I've edited a few essays now and then, but I've never had to like teach English or teach literature necessarily. And there definitely is the sense of that completely automating the grading process is just a bad idea, right? There is something important about both you from a writing perspective and a teacher from a reading and understanding where the student and where the class is. There's something important about just having a human's eyes on what is being given and shared. Like that's just fundamentally important. And you see that, just to be clear, you see that like not just in education, you see that in a lot of areas, right? If myself as like a technical program manager or like my fellow product managers, like, yeah, like if we get feedback, someone's like submits feedback about Khan Academy or Khanmigo, at a certain level, you want to get some eyes on at least like a portion of it. You want to get eyes on it. And the whole point of how you use AI is to give you more time to spend understanding and deciphering and intellectualizing that, not just going and just trying to like automate, just like you would never have a product manager who never looked at any customer or user feedback. You never want to have a teacher who never sees the output of their students, right? It just leads to a lot of bad things. That's one thing. I think a second thing that, and this might be maybe a bit more of a hot take. So any generative AI based chatbot, like anything based off of like Chat GPT or like Gemini, or if you're feeling a little spicy, Grok technology, like you're gonna have some type of moderation. But particularly in an educational setting, I don't think AI should be used to police students. Like if you and I are in high school and we're just like, kicking the can around, we're just like, oh my gosh, like this is so crazy. Like, can you imagine like what if Susie was in like the Scarlet Letter and like, she got thrown into the water? Yeah, Susie's not great. Susie's not a great person. I don't know how much of that conversation, like the in-person conversation that you and I just went and engaged in about Susie, should be recorded, analyzed, and sent to some administrator or adult figure to police you and to call you in and be like, hey, Alex, what were you and Suraj talking about with Susie? That was so inappropriate, right? I don't know if that is where we would want to use AI. And at first you're like, oh, but like no one's doing that. But you have to think about it, right? When you bring in this idea of like speech to text, me speaking into an AI kind of interface or an AI chatbot, right? All of a sudden that gives the capability for a company to record that, analyze that, send it to a administrative or teaching figure.
Yeah.
Now, obviously for certain things like self-harm, gun violence, right? There are very important legal considerations you have to go and consider, as well as just like trying to keep users safe, right? This generative AI technology is a very strange new experiment that has kind of been rammed into classrooms. Most technology is invited into classrooms. Generative AI was kind of like, knock, knock, we're here, let us in. And so, but I do think very specifically on like this, I want to differentiate between like the police kind of monitoring aspect and sort of monitoring students' conversations and how different that is versus more just safety-based moderation and being able to say like, hey, Alex said, and kind of trigger warning here, but like Alex said, I have suicidal ideation, or I'm going to bring a gun to school. That's the kind of thing you want to flag to the appropriate people within a school, but that it's very different than policing, me trying to jailbreak a chat AI agent and be like, oh, I'm supposed to be doing math, but now I'm doing history. And, so I want to differentiate between those two.
Thank you for bringing that up. That brings me to another question I was going to ask you. I remember when I was in school, middle school and high school, it was like, don't use Wikipedia. Like, that's not an accurate source. Here is a large language model that's trained on a bunch of data, but is also essentially
Including
randomly,
Wikipedia.
including Wikipedia, and it's randomly generating text. It's predicting a string of words that comes next. And so I think when it comes to accuracy, hallucination risk, and then to your point around privacy and like, should I be giving my thesis statement? What if one of my college assignments or high school assignments is around something that's personal to me? Like, should I be using this tool at all? How are you all thinking about data privacy concerns and accuracy?
Oh my gosh, two very, very hot topics, both for Khan as well as like for anyone working in this space. So I'll maybe talk about like the data privacy piece first. So like, Khan definitely tends to be like very, very thoughtful with this. Like one of the things I was always thinking about was like for any educational company, what you probably sell, like the first thing in your sales pitch is like safe, like this is safe, right? Then after that, some companies are more like this is safe and engaging, or this is safe and efficacious, or maybe sometimes you want to get like Khan where it's like it's safe, efficacious, and engaging. But like for any AI education-based company worth its salt, it's got to be safe, right? You got to be safe. And part of how you do that is have very, very strict data privacy rules. And like data privacy doesn't stop with you, the company, right? Like let's say that you have contracted to Berry.ai, right? And Berry.ai is going to bring in your speech, your multimodal capabilities, right? Berry.ai is going to help you take in text and translate it to all these various things. So a student's like, oh my gosh, I want to like learn about circles. And your Berry.ai is the thing under the hood that helps to generate circles. Well, that's really cool. But just because Berry.ai is a third-party service, you still have to make sure that they have a data privacy agreement that Berry.ai isn't going to sell their students information. You have to make sure that Berry.ai has really good sort of privacy policies, things of like SOC 1 and SOC 2 compliance, right? That's on you, not just on Berry.ai. So I think that's something that people don't oftentimes realize. Like every technology company is going to have to go and use like third-party providers, like in the same way that like if you have a laptop, but you don't use like a Google Chrome browser or like an Apple Safari browser, you can't do anything, right? So everyone's going to be using these third-party providers, but where data privacy starts is both in your own tech stack and also how you go and engage these third parties to really make sure that it's a village that's offering a safe data protected environment and not just your own company. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing, accuracy, hallucinations. I think how I think about this is that there are certain areas where you need to spend more time to be more accurate. And there's other areas where part of what you might want to go and be able to teach is a certain amount of like discernment. So like when it comes to some of those more like fundamental things, like if I'm teaching like math fundamentals, 5 + 5 is 10. Yes, I did think about that for a second. I was like, yeah, 5 + 5 is 10. However, in the same way, and this is so funny because I did not set this up like this, but like in the same way, when a student asks an LLM and they submit like when LLM's like, hey, what's 5 + 5? And a student is like, oh, 5 + 5 = 10. I want the LLM to spend a little bit more time. And when I say LLM, I mean large language model, which is kind of like the fundamental piece of technology that tends to be under the hood when we say generative AI. So like, I want this LLM, I want this generative AI technology to go and think about it and be like, hey, let me make really, really sure in these fundamentals that I've got this right. Because if I send Alex off into the world thinking that 5 + 5 is 12, as opposed to 10, you're going to mess up his fundamental, his conceptual understanding of things. And you messing up a building block can really, really hurt you in the long run, right? So again, for me, some of those earlier, more foundational and simpler things, that's where you've got to be as close to 100% accurate as you can, right? And there's some different ways to do it. So for example, and this isn't as much a Khan Academy thing as opposed to like what you're seeing out right now, like within the industry, like when you hear people talking about education, LLMs, and agents, one conceptualization of this is like, imagine someone goes and says, hey, 5 + 5 = 10. Is that right? Well, now you might go and have a generative AI technology like Gemini or ChatGPT, or again, you're feeling spicy, Grok. And what that technology can do is go to a calculator and type in 5 + 5 =, the calculator says 10. And then that LLM is just bringing back the answer of 10, right? That helps to ensure an even higher accuracy than the LLM trying to figure it out by itself, right? So like those kinds of things, I think is where the industry is going, particularly with education, to try and heighten up the accuracy on some of those more fundamentals. And you can imagine how that can go and be applied in more English and language contexts or more like historical contexts.
I guess to push a little bit further on this too, in some instances, I've seen people try to relate generative AI to calculator use of like we allowed schools and allowed students to use calculators and that enabled them to do more things. And like this is similarly a tool. But like if I guess if there is
Interesting
a
analogy. I might disagree with that one.
yeah, okay. Yeah, similarly like if there's a risk that it can like give you a completely wrong historical fact,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or give you or hallucinate and tell you the wrong like number for a really basic, equation or constant in a scientific equation. Like if there's a risk that it can do that and misinform the student, why should we allow it?
Yeah, so I'll give you kind of like the classic techno optimist example. And when I say techno optimist, I mean like the group of folks who are like, technology is here, it's going to change the world, and there's nothing you can do about it. So this kind of like techno optimist is, in my world, it's kind of equivalent to like the sort of like
The Bay
the
Area.
techno, yeah, the Bay Area, basically the Bay Area. Not everyone, of course, but like definitely a strong trend of that is in the Bay Area. So the argument for this is, Alex, you know what it's like, and you have seen that kid in the poor area, the more low income area, who you're choosing between, are you going to give them a slightly less than 100% accurate experience or nothing, right? Many people across the country come from areas, school districts, uh, individual classrooms where that individual attention is not a thing, right? On math, right? You're a fifth grade math teacher. You got 25 kids in your class. You teach 5 classes a day for $50,000 a year. That is a lot. That is a lot of burnout. So like the techno optimism response is, but imagine if I can lower the burden of this and instead I might not get that kid the 100% best experience, but if I could get them to a 90% experience at a reasonable cost, would you disenfranchise them just because maybe every now and then 5 + 5 = 12? Would you disenfranchise them for that? That's what that no optimism. Now, though I don't necessarily subscribe to all of that, I do think there is a certain sort of utilitarian argument there. And when I say utilitarian, I mean like sometimes this like branch of philosophy where you try to help the most amount of people with the resources that you have. And if that is not right, you can just cut that out of the podcast.
No, you're right. You're right. Greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people.
Thank you. This is clearly the engineer who took that one philosophy class in undergrad. Thank you so much. That is all I took out of that. But in that sense, you could do a lot of good by helping to get people up. And again, you can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. It's a thing that you hear a lot in technology, but you also hear that in a lot of other spaces. In the same way, I would not want a student to say, hey, you can't write a perfect essay, so don't write that essay. Now, the one caveat to this, particularly for those who are in the more AI responsibility camp, who have a very strong rooting in sort of like safety and ethics and like not introducing harm to students, part of what they would go and say is hey, like essentially some version of we might go and allow more interesting and more expansive uses of AI after a student has mastered certain fundamentals, right?
Mm.
So, which is why you oftentimes see like more AI use being pushed more and more for like higher age ranges, which also tend to have larger classes, right? Your average class size in the fourth grade was probably very different than your average class size when you were a freshman at Georgia Tech,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And so part of the idea around that is like, hey, when did you master these fundamentals and get this good grounding in human intelligence? That's going to give you the intuition, the taste, the discernment for when you go up. And now you're getting access to these different tools. In the same way, when you were in first grade doing 5 + 5 is equal to question mark, I want you to do that without a calculator. But when you're in your early 30s and you're on a podcast, perhaps you might go and have some additional tools for that.
It makes sense in terms of what is potentially possible and sort of trying to weigh out like if I can create a personalized or more meaningful feedback experience for students on a larger scale, right? And it might be off like 10% of the time or even 5% of the time. Is that 5% of occasionally being wrong like worth giving them all that help, right? So I understand sort of the way that you're phrasing the back and forth. I guess one thing I'd like to hear from you more on is given that we know that there is a tendency for some amount of hallucination, or there's some things where an LLM might be more suited for a task versus less suited. How are you all thinking about it when you're constructing, let's say, Khanmigo or a similar tool? Are there certain things that you would suggest for an educator that like wants to start using it, but also wants to stay away from the places that it's not really good at, right? Would you say like use it for a math lesson instead of a history lesson or vice versa?
I think for me, part of why I always like to go and think about is like anytime you can go and can kind of like ground AI technology in a very specific context. A good example of this is maybe like a Notebook LM, which is a tool that came out of like Google Research a couple years ago. And basically they're like, hey, like because AI hallucinates a lot, and especially like 2 or 3 years ago, where that was a even bigger problem than it was today, they're like, it would be really, really great if we could just go and tell the AI, hey, answer these questions, but only look at this document, right? And so one of the things that they were able to go and figure out was, if you go and you tell the generative AI technology, hey, like answer where Alex works, but like only look at Alex's LinkedIn. Or, hey, answer this thing about, Suraj's life, but only look at his memoir, that kind of thing. That you're going to get not only a more accurate answer, but also you can direct the LLM to go and give like very good citations, which is also a great skill. All of a sudden, the technology is actually reinforcing, hey, here's the primary source. Just like you and I, as we were growing up and we're learning to read and write, we realized that the source of the information is in many cases just as, if not more important than the actual information. So I actually think, especially when we come into these topics of like the social sciences or an ELA, I think that's where many education companies, Khan Academy included, are really, 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 really thoughtful about that versus like, let's say when it comes to math, if I use calculator 1 or calculator 2, we're answering much more deterministic type of things. And so it's a lot easier also to see and judge, is this right or is this wrong? The discernment you need to understand that 5 + 5 is in fact equal to 10 is a much lower cognitive lift versus, is Frederick Douglass still alive? You and I know that that is not the case, but would a third grader who's just learning Black history for the first time, would they know? So I do think for me, that's kind of how I think about it. And there is some aspect of like, what is like the worst case scenario? Like the worst case scenario for someone who maybe like gets like a math problem wrong or has like an inaccurate hallucination there might be a teacher goes and comes and corrects that, as opposed to, I don't think a third grader is going to go through their entire life thinking that like 5 + 5 doesn't equal 10. But all that said, I know like a lot of companies, Khan Academy included, is very, very focused on reducing that hallucination and reducing or increasing the accuracy, whether it's in math or ELA or any of our other subjects, increasing that to as high a threshold as possible. Because again, when you were young and when you're being educated, the whole reason why you're in education is because you haven't developed that discernment yet to know what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong. But that's why I always say, like, AI is not here to replace teachers anytime soon. These people who have literally developed their entire careers to master the art of not just getting that discernment for themselves, but teaching it to others,
Right.
that skill's not going away. If you really think about it, in the last 3 to 5 years, the amount of people who are like literally just like the quantity of people who are building and influencing the fundamental building blocks of the future of education has gotten a ton smaller, right? The Googles of the world are maybe like that's like a 100,000 person, 200,000 person company, right? Has an outsized impact on education. But when you go to a company like OpenAI, you're talking like a couple thousand people, maybe like 5,000 people who are now having that same amount of impact on how we are thinking, teaching, grading, creating educational patterns, right? So now this very small segment of the population is having an outsized impact, not just in like the Silicon Valley where I live and work, but all across the world. For me, if you liken this to like democracy, right? If I have a country where, let's say in the US, 400 people elect the president, okay. If it's 10 million people who elect the president, if it's 1,000 people who elect the president, you're like, oh, that's concerning. And if it's 100 people who elect the president, that's extraordinarily concerning. Those are the kinds of things I don't know if everyone's always talking about when it comes to AI in education. And that's for me a conversation where if you are someone who cares about, if you're an education optimist like myself, you always want to be rooted in teachers. You always want to be rooted in the millions of educators, and you always want to be rooted in the hundreds of millions of students and lifelong learners. And that should always be the core, not necessarily like the decision-making power of a very, very small group of tech bros, tech gals, and tech people around the world. So that's something I definitely want our listeners to think about.
What's the remedy? When you put it that way, it is quite alarming to think about, like, fundamental blocks of education, like iPads, or like iPads being owned by like Apple being like a company run by a certain number of people. And then you've got Google, and that being like search being a fundamental for how we do so much of the things that we do in education, book reports and research in Google Docs and Google Drive and all of that. If you're now telling me that like, the way I'm going to do all of this collaboration and even learning is now going to incorporate some sort of AI collaborator or AI tool, and that's 1,000 person, couple thousand person company, you're right. That's a new perspective of like, just thinking about the amount of influence we are now giving to a set of organizations that are not set up to represent a country.
It's a very strange sort of like crossroads where it's like potentially to put agency back into education, we might be accidentally giving it up.
Yeah, no, it reminds me of a conversation again, similarly with the high school English teacher, right? And he did a whole research study within his classroom. They used the writing coach. They used Khanmigo within his set of students. And he, over the course of 2 months, it was able to see with a group of students that didn't have access to the Khanmigo bot, and then a group of students that did. And he was measuring both how their writing improved and if the grades improved, and also how often they were asking for help. And what was interesting, of course, this is one classroom in one public high school, but I thought it was really interesting from his anecdotal experience around, like, what he found was that often as a teacher, like you were saying, 1 to 50, 1 to 30, right? He's struggling to get like thoughtful, full length feedback in response to everybody's essays, because it's like you get them all 30 at once and you're having to grade every single one. But with Khanmigo, a student can put in a paragraph or put in a thesis, get immediate feedback, and then it gives them something to think about. And often he found in the group that was using the writing coach that they asked for help more often, because they were often trying 2 or 3 iterations and then pulling it in to be like, it says I should use more metaphors. Like, what's a metaphor? It gave them more to work with, and then more reason to pull in the teacher, as opposed to feeling like they had to just end in with the final product, which I think is lovely, because it reminds me of what we were talking about at the beginning of like moving away from output only focused assessing and moving
Mhm.
again more towards process? And how are we breaking down the process of what we expect the student to be simulating and doing in their head so that you have more touch points with them to guide them through and grade, make that part of the assessing?
And I will say, and this is you brought up something that I do think is so important for you and for all your listeners to really go and touch on there.
Yeah.
Like obviously, yes, that's a very, very small subsection. One of the things you'll see when you actually look at a lot of the educational research, it does tend to be very, very small groups of students. Like oftentimes not necessarily, you see relatively few of the gold standard of like a randomized control trial. Like you don't tend to see that as much in education for a variety of reasons, right? It'd be kind of crazy to say like, hey, let's like purposely disadvantage a large group of students to see how their outcomes differ, right? Unless you're, talking about the Jim Crow era where we did kind of just disadvantage large groups of students, and that was okay. Obviously, those are things that people nowadays are very, very sensitive to and would not want to go and implement. However, when it does come to introducing new technologies, not every company necessarily invests as much time into what we call efficacy. Like, does your product work for specific outcomes? Efficacy and engagement are very, very different, right? Um, there are some learning language apps that I was trying to get into a couple years ago, and they were super engaging, right? It kept me on a good streak, kept me going learning. But did I learn the language? And did they care if I learned the language? I don't know.
Hmm.
Probably not. I am not fluent in those languages that I was trying to learn. That's very, very different than your educators, your teachers, and your students who are like, yo, like we're here to learn. That's like the main measure of success, not necessarily engagement. We care about engagement because we see it as a proxy for learning if done right. But being able to also just measure that efficacy is so important. It's honestly one of my favorite things about Khan Academy, where there's like an actual internal team of efficacy specialists, people who really devote their life into coming up with ways to measure, like, does certain technology work? Yeah, and the real learning outcomes align with like real learning solutions.
Yeah.
And it's somewhat telling within the AI in the education industry at large that many of the coolest and best and brightest and most interesting tools and teams have not dedicated that time. Because again, if it could take years to do good long-term large-scale efficacy studies, that's a huge risk. Like, can you imagine if I go and you and I create a cool technology, but the Berry.ai, and they do this large-scale RCT, and then it's like, oh, actually, people who use your technology learn less? That would destroy our beautiful company you and I just built, right? So
Yes.
like there's a real risk to education technology companies to doing these things, but that's why I give a lot more kudos to the companies that do decide to do that, to the companies that do invest that time into it. And there's a very strong incentive in many cases to not invest in efficacy and only invest in engagement and these more surface level things. So that's also how I think about like when I look at like a lot of the education companies, right?
Hmm.
Who's here trying to focus on engagement? Who's here maybe just trying to focus on like very specific personas? And who's thinking about learning outcomes from both like the practical, like what is happening in the classroom sense, and also measuring those macro level learning outcomes with good, statistically valid efficacy studies. Like it's hard, it's expensive, it's not easy, but like that should be the gold standard. And that's not necessarily what you see as we've rolled out a lot of new crazy generative AI technologies all around the country. They're really cool experiments, but it's going to take a couple more years for us to really figure out what's working. And yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. I think on this note of it being sort of a wild experiment, like what what is some of the like feedback and gaps that you've heard from teachers who've been using some of these generative AI tools? Like what are they saying that they'd like to see more of or less of maybe?
Oh my, oh my gosh. So I'll never forget this. This is like maybe a couple of Saturdays ago. Khan Academy sort of hosted AI for Education Summit. And I'm in a room with a bunch of current teachers, not
Yes.
like AI technologists, not the tech bros or the tech gals or the tech people, but like current teachers. And they're like, hey, it's kind of crazy how like some schools, don't have like hot water and then other schools get like all the new generative AI stuff. So like when you're talking about a lot of those gaps, the
Mm.
gaps are like on the social services part of school. The gaps are like the schools who are providing food. The gaps are the schools who are trying to help meet students' basic needs. right? The gaps are not necessarily always in like the wow, this like $1 billion technology like messed up on like whether 5 plus 5 was 10 or 5 plus 5 was 12. It's a lot of these more basic human needs and be able to give a lot of the time so that we can better address those needs. I think that's one of the areas where there's some gaps. I also think, and this is maybe more of like a UI UX kind of interface thing, the current wave of generative AI technology is very like person talking to chatbot, person talking to chatbot, chatbot talking to person. I think there's some really interesting things around a more kind of like group facilitation style. So like you and me are having this cool conversation, and an AI assistant is on the side helping us to like prep us and helping to surface different cool insights or things we might have missed. Like that kind of collaboration, but at like the high school level and seeing AI as more of a facilitator. Those are the kinds of things that I think the industry might move a little bit more toward, because those collaborative skills I think are going to be a lot more enduring
Yeah.
than maybe some of the like the more uh, hard skills that are more memorization based.
That leads me directly to the question I was going to ask you next is where do you see, I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of just investment in the K through 12. Like we've OpenAI, like tons of money just flowing into
Mhm.
the K through 12 space, particularly with Gen AI. From your perspective, as you're seeing, as you're both putting the guardrails, seeing what the limitations are, what the potential is, like, what do you see as the future of this space of generative AI and education? Let's say
Mhm.
5 years from now, what do you see it potentially becoming?
Yeah, so three things come to mind. One, just a much more like global expansion of this. Like initially, a lot of the AI education tech companies have been focused on your Western and your traditionally more richer countries. Why? Because like
They
there's
pay for
more money.
subscription.
Yeah, yeah, there's more money there, right?
Yeah.
However, you might not know this, but like half the world's population does not live in the Western
What?
and more traditionally richer like OECD countries, right?
Yeah.
So like that's like huge opportunity. You might even argue if you care about learning outcomes and getting the most amount of doing the most amount of good for the most amount of people, you might argue there's a larger opportunity over in what in the West we traditionally call like the global South.
Mhm.
Like there might be even more opportunity there to not to in a pedantic and patronizing way like help people, but to give folks with tools that access into agency that maybe members of folks over in more American or like Western European countries have had, right? Kind of like in the same way how like when I go and I think of like my experiences with like going and like learning a lot about like China and India and how like the cell phone technology help people leapfrog generations. Like it's like you might not have a bank account, but now you have a bank account tied to like your WhatsApp on your phone, and all of a sudden you have a stronger digital payments than like the rural or the Midwest part of like the America, right?
Yeah.
Like I could see as some type of leapfrogging of technology. And then the third thing that I do think could go and could happen within the next 5 years is just a more expansive view of like learning styles. I think there's a lot of interesting science around like, hey, like Alice, like, are you just a visual learner or is that what you've been exposed to? Because of all the TikTok reels and all the Instagram reels, are you just an auditory learner or did you grow up in a family that allowed you to talk a lot and listen to you? Right. I think we might have a lot more expansive view of that. And essentially, generative AI also enables better research in different types of research studies that might not be as deleterious, or gosh, let me use a non-SAT word. That might be a little bit
That's an
like
SAT
less,
word.
yeah, that might be a little bit less harmful
Yeah.
for folks, right? And now we have better ways of capturing data about individual students, about sort of different uh, ethnic or gender minority groups. And I do think there's a better way to say, like, hey, like, how can we use this technology to help a lot of groups that may have been traditionally marginalized in an educational setting,
Yeah.
support them? I think there's a lot of room for that, and not just saying, hey, I'm going to teach this one way to this one type of kid. And if you're not that type of kid, you're not going to succeed. I think there's some expansion of that.
Okay. I certainly leaning on the techno optimist, but I see it. I see what you're saying. Definitely a lot for me to think about. And Alex, I feel like every time we sit and chat, we can go on, honestly, we've definitely gone for 2 hours in the past as well. We started the conversation thinking about how how assessment looks different in a world where something that would have taken me 12 hours minimum to sit and research now can be generated in 30 seconds, or at least simulate that generation. What does critical thinking look like in that world? And so I
Mm.
think that's where we talked a lot about process. I love the discussion that we had around seeing education being pushed or having the potential to move into more multimodal learning.
Mhm.
And that idea of like, what does it look like when you ask a student to teach something to the class? How does that change their perspective of thinking about the audience, who it is that they're making this thing for? Yeah, I mean, I feel like we covered so many different things about how teachers can use this, how students can be focused more on process, how tools like Khanmigo can give a more personalized experience. And I'm starting to see certain threads around like it seems like clearly a lot of educators are having to make this decision of like the balance of, do I provide this to more people because it does more good than it does harm,
Mhm.
right? And then institutions like yourself at Khan Academy putting in all this effort, having efficacy teams to really minimize the amount of harm that could come out of it, whether it comes from hallucinations or in general moderation, right? So making sure that we're not using it to police, understanding where students are at.
Exactly, exactly. And again, like if I could leave people with like any sense, like I personally don't see myself as a techno optimist, but I am an education optimist, right?
Yeah.
Anytime that we can help give people and individual students or for kids, the students, the lifelong learners, and we can give people like agency about what they learn and how they learn, and still have good ways to go and sort of like help to like measure that actual learning, like you're going to be great. Khan Academy, for example, I mean, we got like a 30-year history of trying to achieve this mission of making education like free, making it global,
Accessible.
making it world class, making it accessible, right? 30 years in that. And a lot of those 30 years were really focused on like, you know, the individual kid who would come into Khan Academy, watch some YouTube videos and really try to better themselves. Like the core thing there is agency. And now we're trying to bring that same level of agency by partnering with teachers, by partnering with school districts, and by partnering with folks all around the world to make it so like the same kid, in this case me, who was like maybe on my spare time would go and learn all these great things in Khan Academy. But in the classroom, I was bored. In the
Yeah.
classroom, I'm like, I'm not reading this Scarlet Letter. Like, this is stupid. How can we go and make that amazing, brilliant, spirited kid outside the classroom and bring that kid inside the classroom and put that kid around all their peers? Like that agency, that's the world that we're going toward. And I can't wait to go and see how this develops. And I'm so happy I get to be a part of a small part of helping to shape
Yeah.
that world.
Thank you so much for coming on. I've got one last question just to end it on a personal note. We started with something good. I'd like to end with, what's one thing that you wish that you knew 10 years ago that you think would have made a difference in
Mm.
your journey? More as a note for a younger version of yourself.
Yeah. So 10 years ago, so that we're in like fall uh 2015. So I'm in undergrad. This is actually before I had the pleasure of going and teaming with you. So I wish I had known how much I would love teaching, how much I would love sharing. I think I was getting to that point of being really comfortable talking and sharing my point of view. But I didn't realize that for me, like the teaching and the facilitation aspect is really where I got my energy. So I wish I had known that sooner.
Yeah.
And maybe I would have even had the chance to even go and like meet and engage with you sooner. So that's what I wish.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Alex.